I'd like to welcome those who may be joining us here. We're going to just take a minute and allow as many to join here before we get started. All right, well, hello and welcome to another installment of the Wireside Chat produced by CTI Connect. Today, I'm joined by Mark Gibson, Director of Business Development at ComSearch, to discuss the new rules being adopted for the 6 gigahertz band. So, Mark, before we dive into it, I'd like you to introduce yourself to our viewers and just give a little bit of background on your involvement in the 6 gigahertz initiative.
Happy to, Joey, and thanks to you for the invite and the opportunity to do this today. I'm looking forward to it. I've been in the industry almost 40 years. All of my career has been with ComSearch and in the area of frequency coordination, spectrum management, and the like. Right now, my job is more in the CTO office of CommScope in a regulatory spectrum policy business development realm. I've been very active in the 6 gigahertz proceeding. I use that term to just define everything that's going on at 6 gigahertz, both on the rulemaking side and the rules themselves. I chair the 6 gigahertz committee in the Wireless Innovation Forum, where I'm actually the vice president of the forum. I'm also on the board of the OnGo Alliance, which is really on CBRS. In fact, I'm in an OnGo Alliance meeting now. And so I've been really involved with trying to translate the rules into what it's going to be to become an AFC. ComSearch has an application into the commission to become an AFC. We're eagerly waiting for the commission to take the next steps. So it's really basically what I've been doing for my 40 years of career.
Well, thanks for that. So this is all about 6 gigahertz. FCC is adopting new rules for the 6 gigahertz band, which opens up about 1200 megahertz of spectrum for unlicensed use. So can you give us a good introduction to that, giving a little bit more detail on the basics of the changes?
Sure. So the 6 gig band is the 5925 to 7125 megahertz band, which lies right atop the 5.9 gig unlicensed Uni 1 through 4. And I think what's the most important about this is the size of the allocation. Doing the math, you'll know that's 1200 megahertz of spectrum. And that's the largest single allocation of spectrum to unlicensed ever. So that's a big deal. The entire allocation, the allocation is entirely unlicensed, but it's cut up into 2 chunks that they're staggered. And I don't know off the top of my head the exact band definitions, but the lower portion, 5925, I think it's to 6425, is Uni 5. And there's a ton of microwave in there. Then above that is 6425 to 6525, I think it is. That's Uni 6. Then 6525 to 6725 is Uni 7. And then 6725 to 7125 is Uni 8. In the Uni 5 and the Uni 7 portion is where they allow, and also the rulemaking accommodates 2 types of operation for unlicensed. One is standard power, and the standard power is considered high power, or 4 watts, and the other is low power, and that's up to 1 watt. And the low power has the additional restriction that it can only operate indoors, whereas standard power can operate indoors and outdoors. And because standard power is at higher power and can operate outdoors as well as indoors, it has to be managed by this thing called an automated frequency coordinating system, or an AFC. And that's basically, the management system that will hopefully ensure that the operation of these unlicensed systems will not cause interference into incumbent microwave. Because what I should have said also is, in that whole 1200 megahertz of spectrum, there are probably 75 to 80,000 microwave systems comprising over 105 to 110,000 frequencies. in many types of use. The most prevalent use in the 6 gig band is for carriers, wireless carriers using it for backhaul, as well as municipalities using it for 911 support for connections to PSAP, public safety answering points. There's a lot of utility use of the band for pipeline management and wire line or transmission line measurement and management through SCADA and the like. And other things. And there's also broadcast use for electronic news gathering, studio transmitter links. There is satellite uplink in the band, as well as mostly uplink in the band actually the traditional C-band uplinks are in that band, as well as Sirius has some uplinks in that band. And then finally, actually, there's passive activities in the band for radio astronomy and Earth sensing satellite. So it's a potpourri of activity.
Yeah, so the way in which I've seen the commission describe it is it's mainly providing a boost to Wi-Fi and other unlicensed uses while protecting incumbent services in the band. So I suspect our listeners are mostly interested in how to approach both sides of this. So if you could dive into that.
Yeah, sure. The band was made available after the commission issued a notice of inquiry that actually made the C-band available. What they felt, and this was back, right around the time CBRS was taking off, so probably 2013, 2014, maybe 2015. They issued a notice of inquiry and they said, let's look at the C-band. And the C-band, as most people know, is the 4 gigahertz and the 6 gigahertz. The 4 gig is the receive part and 6 gig is the uplink. There was an organization that formed, I use that term loosely, but it was a coalition of people that were like-minded called the 6 Gigahertz Unlicensed Spectrum Coalition, or USC, 6 Gig USC, or 6 USC, which comprised, I think, almost exclusively those interested in the Wi-Fi flavor of this. And folks that are members of that included HPE and Aruba, Cisco, Qualcomm, and Google's part of that, Microsoft and others. And so that a lot of people think that unlicensed is synonymous with Wi-Fi, and it's the other way around, more Wi-Fi synonymous with unlicensed. But the commission did not make the allocation exclusively for Wi-Fi, as they do the other 5.9 gig is not exclusively Wi-Fi, it's unlicensed. And so there's other flavors of unlicensed that could operate in the band. The two of the most prominent thoughts are 3GPP for NRU, or new radio unlicensed, which is sort of a 5G flavor. And some people might know that there is a band segment actually in the 5.9 gig band for unlicensed. Isn't heavily used, but there is an allocation, or is a 3GPP assignment. And so there's likely to be the same thing in this band, a 3GPP use for the band for unlicensed. And the other activity that we're aware of is ultra wideband. The UWB folks want to be able to use it for that. Now, whether they're going to use it for high power operation, up to 4 watts or not remains to be seen. But the UWB folks are very active in some of the activities that are going on, which I think we'll touch on later. Again, it's unlicensed operation, and anybody that's familiar with the unlicensed operations, there are myriad uses that you can have out there. But the Wi-Fi, 3GPP, and UWB are the three that seem to be making most of the activities right now.
Yeah, so let's bring this down to the operational level, which where we need to consider what to expect in the field. And I'll just mention briefly that if any of our listeners have any questions, you can submit them via the chat, and we'll field them at the end of this discussion. So don't hesitate to submit them in there. But how do these changes basically begin to influence devices, power levels, and the like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's a lot of ways to look at that. Let's look at the incumbents first to kind of talk about how these changes influence just the incumbent operation of the microwaves. Sure. Without touching on some of the controversy around the allocation, a lot of the microwave users, and many of them are our customers for frequency coordination, have considered the allocation sort of a de facto farming of the band for unlicensed use. Or to some extent de jure, because it's in the rules. And some of them have moved out of the band. one of the issues that we have with just the way the microwave bands are allocated is that the 6 gig band is really the sweet spot for backhaul. It's in that area that is sufficiently low enough in frequency that links do not suffer substantial degradation for long paths. You can have up to 60-kilometer paths, if not longer. We've seen that. But the issue is there's no equivalent band moving up in spectrum that could accommodate that. The next band for that microwave is really the 11 gig. There's some activity in 10, but it's mostly 11 gig. And so there's, 5 gigahertz of spectrum between 6 and 11. And so 11 gig has traditionally been used for short backhaul. And a lot of WISPs use it to connect cell site. Well, a lot of people use it to connect cell site. So that's been the impact on incumbents primarily, is just thinking, okay, I don't want to deal with potential unlicensed interference. I'm going to move out. And a lot are concerned possibly with the potential of interference from the low power operation, which is not managed by an AFC. And then they've made those cases in the rulemakings as well. So that's really what's the incumbents. The new entrants, one of the things that we're seeing is a lot of activity on the experimental side, where a lot of users, primarily for sort of fixed wireless access activity, are using to do some modeling and measurements. So you're seeing equipment manufacturers, and I won't say which ones, but a lot of equipment manufacturers are getting STAs or experimentals. Most of them are STAs. To just do some testing. What does this look like? Can I get 80 meg channels, or what's the maximum I can get? And the commission conditions those authorizations on doing coordination. They call part 101, 103A coordination, I think it is, which means they have to go through the whole thing doing sub-shows and all that. So we're seeing that activity as well. And then it's worth noting that as soon as the band was made available, the Wi-Fi guys started deploying low power devices. And so you can go to Best Buy now actually and buy a Wi-Fi 6E access point that operates low power. So that's maximum watt. So there's those devices out there now, as well as, offshoots of that, dongles, cards for computers and all that. And that's on the Wi-Fi side. Other than that, haven't seen much more activity than that. I think a lot of people are waiting for the AFCs to be authorized before we see a lot more use on the high power side. But it also opens up really tons of interesting use cases for both in-home or in enterprise operation with higher power than you can get for higher than a watt. And that can set up the situation where you'd have something like a higher powered gateway that can be sort of lighting up the house, let's say, using low power indoor for a client type operation. So the rules really talk about this, and a lot of the equipment manufacturers have really interesting ways they're going about doing this. So we're seeing a lot of that begin to take place as well.
Yeah, so I want to turn to the AFC, which is the Automated Frequency Coordination System. And here's where some of the comparisons to the CBRS begin. For any operator who embraced CBRS or avoided it entirely, we know it was a pretty complex process and is. So from our previous conversations, it sounded like that the AFC is much simpler and easier to use. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's funny because I'm at CBRS meetings today with the OnGo Alliance, who are the, association representing the CBRS LTE flavor. And we've sort of recognized that it's complicated. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, it's this sort of three-tiered sharing, so that there is this sharing between layers for the pattern like GAA. So that's complicated. And unlicensed, you don't have any sharing. The sharing is accomplished through the air interface and the contention protocols in unlicensed. And so you don't have an AFC having to deal with that. But probably the major difference in this is that we don't have to deal with the Navy. And so that makes you don't have to worry about the sensor network, the environmental sensing capability of their ESC. That's not part of it. And also, because of in CBRS, we have to deal with aggregate effects. So we have to measure the potential for interference from every operating device and calculate the potential for aggregate effects of interference into the Navy. We don't have to do that in 6 gigahertz. And so that means that, and so in order to be able to do that, effectively, all of the SASs have to share information on all of the devices they're managing. Because you can't know how to manage aggregate power unless you know all the power of all the devices. And that sets up a huge complication of SASs sharing information with each other and then doing calculations. And the nature of those calculations is such that they actually have to be done at low peak times during a sort of a process that happens like at midnight. So all of these aggregate power effect calculations are done literally between midnight and 3 a.m. Eastern time. That's called coordinated periodic activity among SASs, or CPAS. So that activity happens sort of off time. None of that has to happen with AFC. So by virtue of just that alone, AFCs are much simpler. So AFCs don't have to share information with each other. AFCs don't have to calculate aggregate effects. All the AFC has to, oh, and the other thing, the AFCs don't have to keep track of what they tell the device to do. On the CBRS side, the SAS has to keep track of what the device tells the SAS what it's done. So if the SAS says, okay, pick this frequency, the device picks that frequency, then tells the SAS what it's done. The SAS has to keep track of that. We don't have to do that in AFC or in 6 gigahertz. So all the AFC really has to do is when a device has to register so that it authenticates to an AFC. All the AFC has to do is authenticate that device when it registers, verify some registration information, then almost coexistent with that registration message, then it can send a spectrum inquiry request saying, here's where I am, here's what I need, here's the type of device I am, what can I operate on? And then the AFC says, okay, based on what you tell me, here's all the spectrum you have available, and here are the powers. And then the device can go off and operate as much as it wants to. And then it has to recheck the AFC every 24 hours. It gets a grace period if for some reason it can't check it. And then, which is another 24 hours, actually it's 23 hours and 59 minutes. That has to check before 11:59 p.m. the following day, Eastern. And that's all it has to do. Now there's some other nuances, but that's the main thing, that the AFC is much simpler than the SAS, and should be much easier to test and certify and implement. So that's kind of the general thinking there.
Right. That's sort of like the heartbeat that CBRS has, which is, I think, every 15 minutes or so. That's more of like a 24-hour heartbeat.
Yeah, that's a good point. The heartbeat happens for in CBRS. Actually, the heartbeat's every 5 minutes.
Right.
And right. It's that complexity of having to deal with the radars. You know, in CBRS, the radars are mostly coastal radars that are on board. Actually, there are shipborne radars on aircraft carriers. There's some ground-based radars, but the Navy, the DoD did not want a CBSD, which is the device that operates in CBRS, going for more than 5 minutes without some sort of connection to the SAS, because they need to be able to shut down quickly if there's a radar trigger for an ESC. And it gets into all these complications of DPAs and all that. I won't go there. But bottom line is, all those devices have to heartbeat every 5 minutes. So there is a ton of messaging going on just for the heartbeat alone. Now, there's no message on the heartbeat. There can be, the protocol accommodates a little bit of messaging. But for the most part, there is this signal coming to the SAS from the device saying, I'm still here, I'm still here, I'm still here. We don't have any of that with AFC. And so the AFC, or the device, can operate much more autonomously in 6 gigahertz than it can in CBRS, in the 6 gig or CBRS band, the 3.5 gig band, and that is a whole lot less messaging and a whole lot less complexity. And the regulatory framework accommodates that as well. So there's a whole Part 96 associated with CBRS for 6 gigahertz unlicensed. It's basically Part 407E, I believe, in the Part 15 rules. So it's just really a subpart, much like they did with TV whitespace. So just by the virtue of the rules alone, it's a lot easier. And so those are the major things to consider, just the major differences between AFC and SAS.
Right. So I think a big question at this point is, what is the time frame for commercialization or commercializing this as we get closer to it?
That's a good question. We don't know
That's right.
exactly. We know by virtue of everything I said before, the
Hmm.
simplicity and all of that. Um, I can do some comparisons just so we have some level setting. People
Right.
are very familiar with TV white space. And also, as we just mentioned, we talked about CBRS, and those are very similar. TV white space is probably more similar than CBRS, but both of those were situations where the FCC issued public notices to start the process and effectively end the process. And if we use those gating criteria, what the commission did here for 6 gigahertz AFC, they issued a public notice inviting proposals for AFC operators. What we're expecting them to do when all of this process ends, then that they will issue a public notice saying the following AFC operators are granted sort of full commercial authority. If you look at TV white space to begin with, the time between those two gating endpoints was 3 years, actually 3 years and 9 months. For CBRS, the time between those endpoints was over 4 years. It was like 4 years and 2 months. Now, having said that, I don't want to scare anybody away. We're pretty sure that that won't happen. We talked to the Wind Forum and the Wi-Fi Alliance, and if anybody's following the rulemaking closely, you'll see that the filing appeared on the docket as an ex parte. The Wi-Fi Alliance and the Wind Forum spoke with the commission day before yesterday to try to get a sense as to what the next steps will be from them regarding how AFCs will be certified. And that will involve a testing process, which they said that they would do in the rulemaking. So they'll run the AFC through tests. Then there's two other things that have to happen, which could happen coincident. One is something called a public trial, which I theoretically allows the public, air quotes, to come in and verify that the AFC is providing correct results, however that happens. And then there's something called demonstration project, which is essentially a market trial. You deploy a number of devices out there, run them with an AFC, and keep track of what happens. So the FCC have told us, the industry, that they want to see AFC certified by the end of the year. What we presented to them in the Wind Forum and the Wi-Fi Alliance was a roadmap that could effectively accommodate that, but some things would have to happen that probably haven't happened before, and that's the commission moving kind of at FCC relative light speed. But by virtue of the simplicity of the AFC, we think that it could be done. And so what we're really waiting for now is how the AFCs will be tested. Whether the commission will appoint a test lab, whether the commission will allow AFCs to pick their own test labs and show up, what will be the criteria to be able to do that? We're sort of waiting. We think by virtue of the meeting that we had this week, and the Wind Forum is getting ready to meet with the commission again next week, we will have more insight on that. But right now, I'd say, and this is just me talking now in no official capacity, that we have probably a 50-50 chance of having the AFCs certified by the end of the year, fully ready for commercial operation by the end of the year. Wi-Fi 7 devices, which is the next evolution for Wi-Fi 6E, they also will be ready by the end of the year. And a lot of folks are saying 6 gigahertz is very synonymous with Wi-Fi 7. And so it's hopeful that those two can come together so AFCs can be available by the end of the year to support the launch of Wi-Fi 7. And I'm saying 50-50, each day that goes by without any guidance from the commission, that's less likely. The next thing that's supposed to come out of the commission is a public notice saying, here are the AFCs that are conditionally authorized. And there's no reason to believe, based on the interaction with the commission, that it won't be all of us. Right now it's 13. And then the public notice should identify what the next steps are. And those next steps should be hopefully how they're going to test, when they're going to test, and what they're waiting for. So there's a lot more behind the scenes that I won't get into, but they should have, by virtue of our discussions with them, everything they need to at least kick off the public notice that says the AFCs have been conditionally authorized to go to the next step, which is testing. And we're hopeful that that public notice will come out any day now. But again, Wind Forum is going in to meet with them next week, and we're hopeful we can get more information from them about that. Oh, and one more thing. The other thing that has to happen is device certification. And what they've said is that they want to get the AFC certification sort of ongoing started. So this public notice coming out, and then they're going to focus on device certification. And so we're waiting for them to issue some information in their knowledge database, or KDB, about how they will certify devices. And here there'll probably be two types of certification. One is the general conformity testing to make sure the devices operate within the emission mask and all that. And then there'll be certification of the devices with respect to their wearable thought interface with AFCs. And WinForm and Wi-Fi Alliance is writing a lot of specifications around that. WinForm is writing specifications around certification for non-Wi-Fi devices. Those are pretty much ready to go. In fact, we should be filing them shortly. In fact, we have done some of that. So the device certification, we're hopeful, will be almost coincident with AFC certification. So we won't be waiting for one or the other to happen before the other can happen.
Gotcha. Okay, so a lot to look out for in the coming months. We'll keep everyone informed, and we'll keep our eyes peeled for that, for a lot of that. So I guess, what, if anything, should folks be doing now in anticipation of taking advantage of this unlicensed spectrum, and as some of this unfolds?
Well, anybody interested in taking advantage of that should be talking to your equipment manufacturers to make sure that they will be to the extent that they're using standard power in those bands, they will be certified appropriately. If you're an OEM, you might want to be talking to an AFC provider. The AFC procurement model here might be a little different than SAS procurement model was in CBRS. In a lot of instances, SAS procurement was left to the end user. So a lot of end users did their own procurement. There were companies like Cambium, which did some pre-vetting on behalf of their customers, and sort of said, here are the SASs that we approve, and you can pick among these, and others might do that. But if anybody wants to take advantage of the band, you're going to need certified equipment. And you want to operate at higher power, you're going to need certified equipment, and you're going to need an AFC. So you're going to want to make sure, if you're talking to your equipment manufacturer, that they have, if they need the AFC, they have the AFC lined up, or they at least give you guidance regarding how you could do that. And speaking for us as an AFC, we've talked to a lot of folks, and we've got our deckware out there that says, here's how to procure AFC. Here's what it's going to cost. So all those models are out there, and I'm sure a lot of the other major AFC providers have done the same. And so those are the two main things. And the other is follow some of the regulatory activity. There is an open part of the rulemaking, to the extent anybody's interested, that will deal with really two major things. One is very, very low power. I forget what the power limitation is. I think it's 15 dBm per megahertz. I think it is. So it's a power spectral density. Don't quote me on that, but it's the very low power operation is power below this, the low power. And so that allows to different types of operation, and the support for mobility, allowing devices to actually move around. And so we're waiting for the commission to rule on that rulemaking, and that will, to the extent that any of that operation will occur in the bands where they'd have to be using an AFC, then we're going to have to go and accommodate AFCs for standard power operation for devices that are moving around. Not a terribly hard thing to do, but it's not in these current releases. And then just watch for any other regulatory actions. I would suggest folks, primarily OEMs, to keep track of the KDB, because the FCC should be issuing KDB guidance on device certification shortly. That's what we're hearing. So those are the things I think people need to be keeping track of.
Gotcha. Yeah. It's interesting, the mobility piece, because I think a lot of our utility listeners might have that for use of a mobile workforce and things like that. So,
there's a lot of really cool use cases for that right now. I didn't mention this. For example, it's not allowed on any sort of mobile at all. One thing mobility probably won't do is allow you to use it on board aircraft below 10,000 feet. That's one limitation. So aircraft at or above 10,000 feet can use it. I'm looking forward to that, because I don't think anybody would disagree that the Wi-Fi experience on board airplanes is just atrocious. And I think the aviation community is aware of that. So hopefully this will give more bandwidth on board the aircraft. Although the limitation is usually the downlink there. But nonetheless, that probably won't be part of this. It'll be the terrestrial mobility. But even then, that's a good thing.
Right. Yeah. In our previous conversations, we kind of talked a little bit about like how the AFC is governed in other countries. Can you briefly touch on that just a little bit?
Yeah.
For anyone who might be international.
Other countries are kind of looking at what we're doing and putting their own flavor together. Canada just had what they call a consultation, which is the same thing as a rulemaking. That closed last week, usually the last week or week before, seeking comments on how to certify AFCs and other questions about the ban, but that was it. And a lot of folks provided comments on that. So we should probably see something from Canada on that. And they've been participating in the wind forum discussions. We should be seeing something from Canada on that by the end of the year or end of next year about them actually, looking for AFCs and making that happen. I honestly don't know about whether you can deploy very low power up there yet. I don't think so, but if anybody really wants to know, I can find out for them. So that's Canada. We've talked to other parts of the world. Saudi Arabia is looking at this. They haven't decided if they're going to use an AFC, and if so, how. And parts of the Pacific Rim are looking at it. Broadly over in Asia Pacific are looking at it. Japan is looking at it, I believe. Korea is. I don't have all of them in front of me. So there's other parts of the world that are looking at it, and it's important. One thing to think about here, as again comparing to CBRS. CBRS was almost US centric. It was US only, and it was brand new. And so right now, since we've been operating since January of 2020, there's about 240,000 CBSDs that have been deployed. And the use cases are different, but there were market studies that showed that there would be many more than that by this time. For this band, especially for 6 gigahertz, especially for especially for Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi Alliance has done some studies that show, or actually initiated studies that show the pent-up demand for this band is sky high for both very low power and standard power. Billions of devices by 2024, 2025. That might get pushed out a little bit if there's any more delay. And it's important also to know that Wi-Fi is harmonized worldwide. So a lot of countries are going to want to harmonize their rules to make it easier to use Wi-Fi, which is, again, used worldwide. So I don't think we'll see a whole lot of dissimilarities with the way it's being rolled out in other countries. It may just be taking a little longer to see how things are happening in the United States.
Right. Okay, so I think we're going to turn to some of the questions that have come in since we've been talking, and there's a couple of them here. I can go ahead and read one here. So will AFC analysis calculate aggregate interference potential of high concentrations of unlicensed devices into licensed operations?
It will not. We're not doing aggregate effects. The FCC concluded in the rulemaking that aggregate effects were not going to cause problems, which generally is what we see anyhow in this type of operation where the powers are generally the same. The interference mechanism is really single exposure. Now, what the commission has kind of done in the interference protection criteria is a little bit accommodated multiple exposures, but the SASs aren't not calculating aggregate effects of any of this. So we're not really calculating any aggregate effects into any of the licensed operations.
Gotcha. Okay. Just as a reminder, if anyone has any questions, please submit them, and we'll definitely take the time to answer them. So another one here is a neighboring WISP got an experimental license in 6 gigahertz. I have 6 gigahertz links, but I never got a coordination notice. Should I be worried?
Worried. You should give concern, perhaps. One thing we've seen historically in the commission is lack of consistency on the conditions they put on any experimentals. We saw this in CBRS. We saw this in other bands too. And it's not that isn't necessarily a problem. It just means that it depends on, who ends up reviewing the licensing request. What we have seen is a little more regularity regarding the conditions they put on the license as opposed to the grant. And so that's a big concern, a big distinction. Some situations, especially situations, for example, where you're dealing with interference with aeronautical mobile telemetry, the coordinator for that is an organization called AFTRAC, not AFLAC, but AFTRAC. And AFTRAC is an acronym that I can't quite remember, but they do all the coordination for AMT. And the commission puts conditions on those licenses as a condition of grant. So in other words, you have to have that done before you apply. Here, they're putting these conditions on authorization or operation, which means they'll give you the grant, but you got to do this after the fact. What we've seen them do is put a condition that it has to be a Part 101, 103A, I believe, which is full, PCN, SUPSHO, and everything. If people aren't used to doing that, then they probably don't know that they've got to do all of that. And for the most part, unless they know their neighborhood pretty well, they probably don't know who to send the coordination notices to. So, and I'm not going to go and say that people aren't necessarily complying with that, but we haven't seen them either from the standpoint of protection. We're in a protection service associated with frequency coordination, and we've seen very few, if any, coordination requests come over. So what I would suggest people do is monitor the FCC's experimental licensing process. There's a way to do that using something called an RSS, which is a news feed. I forget what that acronym stands for, but you can actually get into the commission's experimental licensing system and set up an RSS feed. So you'll get notified anytime there is an experimental license issued, period, in anything. And you can click on the email, bring up the link, and it'll take you right to the grant, and then you can see if there is a commission granted an experimental in your area. All of them have a stop buzzer, so a contact person in case there is interference. You could call that person and say, "Hey, I see you're operating. I didn't get notified. I'm a licensee. Please, let's coordinate this." I can say pretty much that very few have contacted us to do the coordination on their behalf, in which case we would have done all of that. So that's one thing to do. So follow the experimental licensing system, the ELS, set up an RSS feed. You'll get notified of any experimental by virtue of the call sign. Look at the grant, see who the contact is, see where it is, and then follow up accordingly.
And if you're looking to get access to an experimental license, you can do that through CTI Connect with our partner ComSearch as well. So keep that in mind. So this next one, this is interesting. Obviously, with CBRS, we saw a cost involved with the access to the frequency, the 3 gigahertz frequency. Is there a cost associated with AFC?
There probably will be. I know there will be to use ours. These AFCs are third-party commercial operations, and so there's a cost to develop the AFC capability. There's a cost to get it certified. There's a cost to run it. And so, and we're not making millions and millions of dollars on this. I could tell you with CBRS, we're not, which is one of the reasons we're not doing CBRS SAS anymore, or won't be shortly. And so there will be a cost associated with the AFC. But again, we're trying to keep the costs, I will say generally, I won't speak for the industry, but I can certainly speak for our company. We're really trying to keep the costs down. We're trying to keep the complexity down so we can offer the AFC service to those that need it almost seamless, so that the AFC is going to operate in the background and you won't even know it's there. But yes, there will be a cost probably.
Next question here is how much spectrum is even available in 6 gigahertz? So if it's so encumbered, will there even be enough for me to get a 10 megahertz channel, let alone 160 megahertz channel? I know that with CBRS, there was a lot of questions regarding the GAA and how much you'd even have access to. So yeah, take that one.
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends. The answer is it depends. If you are in the middle of, say, Idaho, you probably are not going to have a problem finding any spectrum. And you can take a look at the spectrum maps. We make them available in both lower and upper. There was a really good IEEE article a couple months ago in the IEEE Spectrum, which is IEEE's magazine, written by a colleague, Mitchell Lazarus, who's one of the most brilliant people I know. And he had one of our maps in there showing these. And if anybody's interested, I can give them a link. I can't do it now because I can't remember it, but I can direct people to that article. I think that question probably is related to urban areas or where there's a high concentration of microwave. And the answer is, you're probably not going to get a 160 meg wide channel in areas where there's a lot of microwave, because a lot of microwaves are using 40 meg wide channels, some use 60 meg. And so, there are going to be issues there. You should be able to get a 10 meg channel. We did early on, before the rules were even finalized, we did some modeling in the Dallas-Fort Worth area using what was at least in the rulemaking and using aggregate effects. And we were able to find 40 meg wide channels in a decent part of the Metroplex. 80 meg wide channels were a little more problematic. And so it depends on where the microwaves are located. And I would say that a lot of the folks in the unlicensed community think that there's a lot of white space out there because the microwaves are only in certain locations. But when you get into an urban area like Dallas, Fort Worth, or any of the, like that we call the NFL cities, getting a 160 meg wide channel might be a little more challenging. So again, the answer is it depends on where you are.
Right. Okay, well, I think that is all the questions we have. This has been a really fruitful conversation, and appreciate everything. If anyone has any additional questions or looking for any more answers as this starts to unfold over the coming months, reach out to CTI Connect, and through our partners comp search, we'd be happy to get you as much information as it comes forward. We do have a survey at the end here just to kind of gather any other questions you may have, and then as well as if anyone has the interest in utilizing 6 gigahertz, what would be your time frame for deployment? Because that feedback is going to be very valuable for us and our friends at ComSearch to kind of help Mark with all the alliances that he's involved in, and as this starts to unfold. So again, thanks for everyone for joining. Mark, it was a pleasure.
Thank you, Joey, and thanks for the questions and for the session. This was really helpful, and I hope folks got a lot of stuff out of it. And so look forward to doing another one when we can.
Sounds good. If anyone has any questions, just reach out, and have a wonderful day. See you later.
Thanks again. Take care.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Right. Bye.